Welcome to the Bronx Book Festival. You're joining us for Unapologetic and Searching Latinx Voices in Fiction. And our moderator today is Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa. Dahlma is Rico and raised in New York City. She is a product of the Puerto Rican communities on the island and in the South Bronx. She's the author of Daughters of the Stone, which was shortlisted as a 2010 finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Dahlma's short stories have appeared in various anthologies and literary journals throughout the United States, Africa, and Brazil. Since her retirement, Dahlma continues to dedicate herself to her writing, speaking engagements, and workshops. She resides in the Bronx with her husband, photographer Jonathan Lessa. Dahlma, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I am so pleased to be here with my fellow panelists, Lorraine, Ivelisse, and Melissa. And thank you for all the people tuning in and all the readers who have supported us all along. I'll start out with by introducing you in their short biographies. And we'll start with Lorraine Avila. Lorraine is the author of Malcriada and Other Stories. She is an Afro-Quisqueña, Quisqueyana, born and raised in the Bronx, a literacy educator, a lifelong storyteller. Avila has a BA from Fordham University in English and Middle East Studies with a minor in creative writing and a master's in teaching from New York University. In 2019, she became one of the Wing Scholarship Program's recipient. Her writing has been published in Catapult Magazine, Asterisk Journal, Palabritas, Hippocampus Magazine, Moco Magazine, The Girl Mob, La Galeria Magazine, and Blavity. And you can learn more about Lorraine at lorraineavila.com. Secondly, Melissa Rivero's debut novel, The Affairs of the Falcóns, won the 2019 New American Voices Award and was longlisted for the Penn Hemingway Award, the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Born in Lima, Peru, and raised in Brooklyn, she is a graduate from NYU and Brooklyn Law School, and she currently works as in-house counsel at a startup. Melissa still lives in Brooklyn with her family, and you can learn more about Melissa at melissa-rivero.com. Ivelisse Rodriguez's debut short story collection is Love War Stories, a 2019 Penn Faulkner finalist and a 2018 Forward Reviews Indies finalist. She has published fiction in the Boston Review, All About Skin, short stories by women of color, Obsidian, Quelly, the Bilingual Review, Asterix, and other publications. She is the founder and editor of an interview series focused on contemporary Puerto Rican writers, published in Centro Voices, the e-magazine for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. She was a senior fiction editor at Quelly and is a Cambilio and Vona Voices alum. She is currently working on her novel, The Last Salsa Singer, about 70s era salsa musicians in Puerto Rico. She earned her MFA in creative writing from Emerson College and a PhD in English creative writing from the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois at Chicago. To learn more about Ivelisse, visit www.ivelisserodriguez.com. Welcome, ladies. There are basically three parts to our conversation. And the first part is about your writing journey. The second part are a few questions that I'll throw out at you. And the third part are questions that come from the audience. So that should give people a kind of rounded view of who you are and what your work stands for. So we'll begin with a generalized question of why did you become a storyteller and when did that happen in your life? And anybody can jump in. Okay, Ivelisse, you can start. Thanks for volunteering.
I'm about to raise my hand.
Okay.
Well, for me, it starts off in a sort of odd way. I believe I was like in the fifth grade, and I was like 10 years old, and like our entire school had to write a story, and my story was like a paragraph long, and all I remember about my story was that I used the word grotesque in it because I was a little nerd and I would look up words that I didn't know and actually use them. And so what happened was the principal came to my classroom and she said I had the best story. And then she gave me a chocolate bar. And then it was a wrap. And I was like, I'm going to be a writer. So I can get all the chocolate in the world.
There you go. That's a great reason. Melissa? Melissa, how about you?
I became a writer after hearing, well, let me think about it. I started writing this book after I heard a story that my mother told me, but I think I've always been a writer. I remember being 5, 6 years old and like watching novelas with my mom and writing synopsis of what like I thought was going to happen next, you know, to the protagonist or whatever. And so I was always writing stories growing up. And then, but it wasn't until I had heard the story that my mom told me about something that happened to her when she first came to this country, that I found this character and that I really loved. And I'll use this word again because I've used it before, but I become a storyteller when I find a story and a character that seduces me to come back to the page. And so I found my character, I found Anna really engrossing, and I found her world intriguing. And so I felt compelled to tell her story.
Yeah, that's a great reason. Lorraine.
So likewise, I felt like I've always been a writer. I used to basically try to communicate with a lot of like my family members back on the Dominican Republic by sending them letters when I was like in kindergarten and I learned how to write. And I remember that really clearly in my head and it being like a trait that specifically like my grandmother took a lot of pride in. And yeah, after that, I kind of like used to write short stories for myself here and there, but I didn't necessarily like jump into publishing a book until I became really tired of teaching middle school and literally used to use all my free time to write. And I was like, you know what? If this is what makes me feel happy and gives me purpose right now, then it's what I'm going to do.
Absolutely. Sounds like all of you had a passion that you needed to follow. Okay, the title of our panel is Unapologetic and Searching. So, Lorraine, let's start with you. How do those themes, unapologetic and searching, inform your characters?
Yeah. Well, I would say most of my characters feel really like unapologetic because they're basically at the point where there's no way into healing other than like speaking up or going into action. And so I think they're searching for a point in which they feel comfortable in their skin, comfortable with what was given to them. But the unapologetic feels very, very like true to a lot of my characters. So yeah.
Thank you. Melissa? Melissa?
Yeah, so can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. What makes my characters unapologetic? I think that Anna, my protagonist, doesn't feel any sort that she needs to apologize for any of her actions. She's very bold. And she just goes about life trying to figure out she knows what she thinks is best for her and for her family. And so she goes about life just acting. and not apologizing at all for her actions. Even though, quite frankly, as I was writing her, I was just like, "What are you doing, Anna?" But like, I'm in the
Yes.
but I respected the fact that this is how she approached her situations in life, and she didn't care what anyone thought, and that's something that I could really relate to and appreciate.
Okay, great. And Ivelisse?
My female characters are unapologetic because they are streaming against traditional notions of womanhood in the sense that they've been told all their lives that they need to grow up, they need to have a man, etc. And so they're bucking against that essentially towards the end of the stories that I have. So what they're battling with are these narratives that they've been told that to grow up, they need to have a man, etc. But then there's also this counter narrative that they're also being fed at the same time, which is problematic. The counter narrative is that men are socios and you have to stay away from them, etc. And so they're trying to sort of navigate this. And then they're also bucking against traditional notions of what love is, etc. And so for women, I think heterosexual women are told that love is like the thing that they must aspire to, that it's the thing that's going to like complete them or what have you. And so I feel like for my characters, what they're ultimately learning is how problematic love is, and how by staying with somebody because they love them, etc., it leads them to really sort of treacherous relationships that lead to abuse, lead to betrayal, etc. And so at the culmination of the book, what one of the characters learns is that there's so much that comes after love. Meaning that I want these girls in my book to learn that love isn't the end all, that that's just a starting step in a relationship, and that what they need to look for is kindness, respect, courtesy, etc. So again, they're just moving against traditional notions of womanhood and of romantic love.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next question is, every fiction writer creates a world and then seduces the reader into following her into that world. So describe your world for us, and how do you seduce the reader into coming with you on these narratives? Melissa.
I did it by starting with something that Anna loved, which was her food and cooking. And I think that's the way to most people's hearts, in my opinion. Like, you can't, just seducing them with a good meal. And so here, but it's not just a good meal for her. It's also just something that reminds her of her mother, reminds her of home, and is something that she wants to one day aspire to be, which is to have her own restaurant. And so I think I bring the reader into the world by giving them a little taste of what it is that my character really wants, and having them understand why this character loves that thing so much.
Okay, thank you. Lorraine?
Well, I think my world is very realistic to Dominican culture or Latinx culture, mainly because it really focuses on women who are labeled malcriada or badly raised, or just like, anyone who basically talks back or sends or goes against the grain or whatever. And so it's very realistic in that sense. But I think the way in which I try to seduce readers is basically by telling them, like, hey, we are going to have to really look at these wounds, these cultural wounds, and these wounds that belong to us maybe in private, and in order to come out of this in a way that feels healing or feels okay for us. So it's kind of a dark seduction, I guess, but it's the seduction I felt like my characters and readers might be best interested in.
Okay. And Ivelisse?
I think a lot of my language is seductive. Like I always, in my mind at least, I think of it as like effusive in the sense that it's very emotional, and I think it's meant to really touch somebody's heart. So for example, when I'm looking for a book, and something that stands out to me about that book is that it offers me like a balm on the heart, like for the heart. Like it offers me a line, you know, some sort of mantra that I can carry with me, and that, you know, in these, I don't know, like if you're like sad about a breakup or what have you, like you can pull that line and you can, you know, help it soothe your heart. And so I think that's, at least in my mind, I hope that's part of the seduction that I'm trying to create, is via language and, you know, offering these real human sentiments that I think people can connect with and carry with them, like way after they've read the book.
Okay, great. In reading your 3 books, 2 things really struck me about it. The urban landscape of it is one, and the other is the balance between their US life and their cultural homeland. So can you talk a little bit about that dichotomy or duality in the world that you have created? Because it's different in each one of you. So, Lorraine?
Yeah, so as a Dominican, I mean, I have U.S. born privilege, right? But I feel like it's very real that there is a dichotomy to who I am and to my characters naturally. And so I think I tried my best to document what feels most like home to me in terms of the landscape, both in the Bronx and in Bonao from the in Dominican Republic. And while I feel like these landscapes have definitely been mentioned before, it felt really important and timely for me to document them in a way that, like, for me, I kind of told myself, like, this is going to be an archive of your memories, even though they're coming out through characters, right? And especially now, at least in the Bronx and like uptown with gentrification, it feels like my Bronx and my Washington Heights, my uptown is slipping in a way that like my nieces and nephews, maybe 10 years from now, won't see the Bronx in the same way I've seen it. So I think for that reason, and because I love what both places have given to me, it felt very important to include them in my story in a way that felt as authentic as possible.
And you certainly achieved it.
Thanks.
Ivelisse?
Sure. So in my collection, Love War Stories, there are a lot of stories set in Western Massachusetts. And so I grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts. I was born in Puerto Rico, but I believe we went to like Holyoke when maybe I was 2 years old or something like that. And so it was important for me to write about Holyoke and about Western Mass. So I have a PhD in English and creative writing, and one of my areas is Latinx literature. And then, of course, I read a lot of Puerto Rican literature from the continental U.S. And none of the Puerto Rican literature from the continental U.S. Offered any narrative that was set outside of New York City. And I thought that was problematic because there are all these other enclaves of Puerto Ricans in the continental U.S. that we never hear about. And so, for example, I grew up in Holyoke and Western Massachusetts, and there are a bunch of Puerto Ricans there in cities like Holyoke, Chicopee, Springfield. And then we crossed the border, and then we're next to Connecticut. So there are a bunch of Puerto Ricans like in Hartford, Bridgeport, etc. And so with Holyoke, the Puerto Ricans went there like in the 1950s to work in the tobacco fields. And again, that's a narrative we never hear about. And Holyoke also has the highest concentration of Puerto Ricans outside of the continental, outside of Puerto Rico. And so it was important for me to add something to the body of work of Puerto Rican literature. And so I wanted to make sure that I represented another enclave that's never heard about. So in that way, in my story, Holyoke Mass and Ethnography, I think I really captured what it was like to grow up in Holyoke and be a Holyoke girl, where you know, you always have to be ready to fight. Like, I guess you're in a constant state of anxiety. Like, you know, I'll tell people I grew up in a violent world where, you know, some things are the norm or what have you, and you know, like I watch TV now and there'll be like some 19-year-old woman, she'll be like, oh, I didn't know there was such evil in the world. And I'm like, really? Because I knew that when I was 3. And so, you know, that's the world I grew up in. And the way that it juxtaposes with Puerto Rico, I'm not sure. And I feel like we got a lot of the same cultural messaging. So again, these ideas of what women are supposed to do. My mother grew up in Puerto Rico, and so, you know, she's very much like, don't get pregnant, you know, don't have boyfriends, etc. And so I feel like a lot of the cultural messages that I would have gotten in Puerto Rico, I still got in Holyoke. Mm-hmm. Again, because there were so many Puerto Ricans, and even though there are other people in Holyoke, it really felt like a Puerto Rican world to me. So I don't know. I think it's almost like an easy translation from Puerto Rico to Holyoke in terms of cultural norms.
Okay. Now, Melissa, your protagonist has a slightly different relationship with her home culture. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. She has a...
Okay. Your character has a different relationship with her home culture. So do you want to talk a little bit about how she navigates these two?
Yeah, so so Anna is a woman and she is from you know, the province. So she's not from like Lima, the capital. She is indigenous. And her husband is this light-skinned mestizo guy who's from the capital. And so in Peru, she is automatically, like, she feels like the country does treat her differently. Like, she's just seen as someone, or she is seen as someone who in some ways is, if you read Peruvian culture, would be conceived as a threat in some ways, Peruvian history rather. And so the way that she believes that if she were to stay in Peru, her culture would basically keep her here. Like, and there's no room for her to grow. There's no room for her to progress, whether it be via education or professionally or with her own like life goals. Whereas her husband can navigate that world, you know, much better than she can, right? He's a guy, he like is like white presenting. And so the culture is made to prop him up. And so when they come to this country, there's this, you know, the themes of colorism, which are like, you know, I mean, the issue of colorism is a thing that we need to address in the Latinx community, which we don't. I don't think we do in the way that we should, or with the frequency that we should. But you know, they surface here in a way that is that causes friction between her and her husband, because she wants to stay in the United States, thinking that at least here she has a chance of maybe achieving her goals. Mm-hmm. Where her husband feels like, well, I'm better off being in Peru, because at least there I'm not some undocumented person with no potential to grow or to succeed. At least there's opportunity for me. And so there's that causes marital tension, but it also causes friction between her extended family, and even in some ways, I don't think she feels conflicted about staying here. But for me, like as I was writing the story, it only gave me, it made me want her to succeed so much more and to stay so much more, because it seemed like going back would be so unfair to her.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, the issues of race and class are just as strong as the issues of homeland.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now we can go on to our audience questions. And the first question is, in each of your books, what is the most challenging scene to write? What was the most challenging scene to write, and why was it challenging? Ivelisse.
The most challenging scene for me was in a story called The Belindas, and it's in the scene it's after David has slapped Belinda, and so she doesn't really sort of know how to deal with her now fractured self. And in the scene, she's crying and she's trying to grieve, but he sort of really moves in on her hour of grieving, and they ultimately have sex at the end of the scene. And what was to write? Well, it was on two levels. First, as a writer, you want to make sure that you again convey like human emotions in a really authentic way, and in a way that people can empathize with. And you don't want to sort of move over into melodrama, and then those feelings can never really be felt by the reader. And so that takes a lot of whittling down the words, and like sitting with every word to make sure that it strikes the right note, etc. And then the other thing is kind of an emotional aspect of writing, in the sense that you, at least me as a writer, have to sit. I have to sit in the scene, and I have to sit there and imagine it. I have to sit there and imagine her pain, and I also, to make a rounded character, I have to sit there and think about how David feels, even though he's the abuser. And so I have to sit, in these very complicated and hurt feelings, and I have to sit with them until I get them right, until I feel like I've done justice for both characters. And so that can be like emotionally draining. And so, so that was the most challenging scene for me, I think.
Right. I totally agree with you that in order to get the reader to be there, you have to be there. And then use words to convey that thing that you are feeling to someone else. Lorraine, how do you feel about it?
Yes, just backing off of what was just said, I think the idea of having to like sit in situations in which you may or may not, as a person, not necessarily as a writer, been in that situation. So for me, it was definitely like any scenes that had to do with sexual abuse felt very like complicated and uncomfortable for me. For the reason I just said, like having lived through that, but also feeling as if like I want to ensure that the character is given like a full chance versus staying, just becoming a survivor or victim. And that's something like I've grappled with myself, in terms of like, I want to be seen as a whole person. If I share this, am I only going to be seen as this? So I would say like those scenes, and I think there are two in my book, one in Justice and one in Mija, that dealt with that. And I even like thought about like, should I give like a trigger warning or anything like that? And after like speaking to like various of my like friends and just colleagues, it was kind of like, violence is put in our face without any kind of like, hold up, something's about to happen. It's just like, here you go. You've dealt with this for so long. Here you go again. And so I also tried my best to make those scenes feel like okay, not okay for the character, but like that the reader can like sit through them. And I know from like feedback I got that some folks had to put the book down, and like that's perfectly fine. I do that when I'm reading.
Right.
But yeah.
Wonderful. Melissa?
I think for me, the most difficult scene to write was also like a sex scene, a sexual encounter that happens in the book. And it's again because I wanted to be respectful of the character of what was happening and respectful of Anna. And it is uncomfortable to sit in that space and to write those scenes. And I often find myself feeling very uncomfortable, but then also like just finding ways to sort of like maintain that distance, but still hopefully try to convey just how difficult that experience is for my character, without making it seem like it's exploitative or over. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you, especially because there are so many stereotypes about Latina women that I feel like, okay, how am I going to deal with this that doesn't add to that stereotype, but it's still realistic to my characters? So that's always a fine line to cross. Another question, who are your literary madrinas or padrinos? Those writers who you feel were your guiding lights, I guess. Lorraine?
Yeah. For me, I feel like the top one is Roxane Gay. I think while I was reading this, while I was writing this collection of short stories, I had to like reread all of her work in order to feel like I had like a lot of permission to write what I wanted to write, and to like remind myself that there was another Caribbean woman who had like done this already, and who had like exposed a lot of like the wounds in our cultures and in our just like day-to-day life. I would also say Angie Cruz. I remember like reading her book Soledad when I was like 12.
Yes.
I didn't understand it then, but definitely the idea that I can write about ordinary people like my mother and my aunts was definitely enhanced by that. And then Edwidge Zanticott, another Caribbean writer, which I feel like is everything, honestly. So those three for sure.
Great. Melissa?
Definitely Christina Garcia. I remember reading Dreaming Cuban and just like thinking, oh, I could be friends with this person, the young person in this book, and oh, this woman her mother reminds me of my mother. So certainly her and her body of work. Mario Vargas Llosa, the way he writes about Peru and the detail and how he captures the setting. And Luis Alberto Urrea, who's just, aside from being a great writer, he's just a very giving person.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. And Ivelisse?
Sure. So I would say my top three are Piri Thomas, Sandra Cisneros, and Juno Diaz. So with Piri Thomas, he's the first book by a Puerto Rican that I ever read. I believe I was 13. It was my first year in high school. And the thing that struck me was that even though he was recounting his life in the 50s, how it still seemed so pertinent, the life that he was talking about. Right. It seems so pertinent in the 90s. Like, you could have just changed the date on the book and I would have believed that it happened, 40 years later. For me, Sandra Cisneros and even Toni Morrison, I would say, are the two that I love their play with language, and they're the ones for me who have those lines that I can carry with me, and that, I can use to soothe my heart at some other point in time. And then for me, Drowned by Junot Diaz is, to me, it's everything. It's that bridge between literary fiction and, talking about your own community, which I feel like other people hadn't done before. And for me, the texts of these writers are texts that stand the test of time, that I read over and over again. And I may find things that are problematic later on, especially with Perry Thomas. The older I get, I'm like, oh, he was a wife beater. And but their work still, offers me a lot. And other people like Christina Garcia, who's been generous with her time, and just the feedback she's given me on my work is feedback that I still carry with me and that I utilize now, however many years later after she gave it to me. So
terrific. I so agree with this whole list, everyone you've mentioned. I think that probably they've contributed and touched more writers than they know. And I'm so glad to hear that. Everyone wants to know what you're reading now. What books are you reading now? And what is your next book on your list? Melissa?
I'm currently reading Never Look Back by Lilian Rivera, and I have Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis on deck after that.
What was the second one?
Cantoras.
Cantoras by Di Roberti. Great. Ivelisse?
I'm going to read Jenny McFarlane's new book. The title escapes me still. It's called The House of Something, and I started it the other day, and it seems super intriguing. And I just finished Melissa's book, and I also just bought Lorraine's book, so I'm going to be reading those. And I want to read The World Doesn't Require You, Rian Amakar Scott's new book, which I haven't read. And then I also have a list of books that authors have sent me that I need to read. The new book by Kaylin Hughes, and Staten Island Stories by, I forgot her first name. I feel like it starts with a C, but her last name is Jimenez. But it's a collection of short stories about Staten Island, published by, I think, John Hopkins. So I have plenty of books to read this summer that I need to get to.
That'll be 6 months worth of reading there.
I know.
Okay. Lorraine, did I ask you already?
No.
Okay.
I've been reading a lot of poetry lately. I think as the world gets heavier and heavier, it feels hard to engage with a full novel or book. I've also been reading short stories here and there. So I'm reading right now short stories. Zora Neale Hurston, who is also a Madrina, her collection of short stories that was recently published, hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick or something. I'm getting through that, and I'm also reading, when it comes to poetry, The January Children by Safia Aliho, and If They Come For Us by Fatima Ashgar. And next, I'm trying to read Ivelisse's book next.
Okay. Someone has said that writing is like mining for jewels, and if we look at writing as mining for jewels, where do you find your jewels? Where do you mine for your stories? Ivelisse? Ivelisse is muted. Okay.
Sorry. I free write a lot, so that because there's usually like a concept that I want to convey, and I do a lot of free writing before I can get to the actual scene. And so when I'm doing the free writing, I'll just write, and it's easier for me to do it on paper than on the computer. And so then what I do then is I go back through my notebook and I'll underline lines, phrases, or concepts that I want to convey. So for me, a lot of my gems come through free writing, and then, I can, some more gems may come out while I'm actually writing the scene and trying to make it tight. But it really starts with the free writing and not like putting any pressure on myself and just letting my mind go. And so that offers me the most.
Great. Melissa?
I often find the gems, just in the writing. Like you put some words on down and you discover a person or character that you find interesting, and then slowly you start like polishing that. And I find that those gems end up being things that are important to me in my own life. Things that are important to the people in my community, things that are important to my family. And it just so happens that I find this one character that becomes a vehicle through which I can communicate some of these things.
Okay. And Lorraine?
I think when I start forming a story, I definitely have to have like one line come into my brain in which I feel like the character is speaking to me and says this one thing or feels this one thing. So, for example, in one of my stories, like a line that came to me was like, I'm 16, but I feel like a trillion, mostly because I don't die. And that line, like still to this day, I'm just like, I don't remember the moment in which it entered my stream of consciousness, but I remember it like stopping me in my tracks and feeling like I have to write this story. And even though this character feels like a sad girl or a sad character, she's feeling a generation of things, and so she's worthy of writing. And I'm moving away from the idea that my jewels only have to be like joyful, because I get that, and I definitely, as someone who writes a lot of like sad girl stories, definitely feel like I want to move away from that and explore joy. But I feel like there's so much going on in my characters in terms of like it's been an ongoing like passing down of trauma, and there is joy in that, again, healing. And I know I keep saying that, or not healing, but in terms of processing and like mining through like the things that have happened to my grandmother and my great grandmother, and like what does that mean for my character in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So I guess like most characters, you mine your life and the people in your life to
Sure.
enhance the work. Yeah. I have another question for you that's really important to me, because that whole concept in our culture is really interesting to me. There's the whole issue of el que dirán, right? Ivelisse started her short story collection with el que dirán. And el que dirán is, for people who don't know, it's about the community gaze, which seems to be a much more stringent gaze on women than it is on men. So I'd like you to talk about a little bit about how el que dirán figures into your stories that we are discussing today. Lorraine?
Yeah, I feel like the community gaze interrupts a lot of the living that my characters are trying to do. And to be honest, a lot of the living I try to do, I think my mom and my grandmother just like raised me with that saying, like, ¿qué va a decir la gente? ¿Y qué van a pensar de ti? And it's just like, at the end of the day, you don't even have time to conceptualize who you are, because you're just trying to paint this picture for the outside. And I mean, I feel like it's so true to our culture, and to go back to Melissa's point in terms of like classism and the racism and the self-hate that exists in our communities. Like, we build that gaze, but we also like, it's community gaze, but it's also like the white gaze. Like, we're so aware of it at all times. And right, because like I remember growing up, and it's like the proper girls were certain girls doing certain things, and because I was doing other things that other types of girls did, right, like that excluded me from a certain community, and that's what my mom didn't want, right? So I think like a lot of my characters deal with that and have tension with that, and part of like the breaking free part is being unapologetic and being like, yo, fuck it, like, okay, like I have to create who I am, right?
Right. Okay, Ivelisse.
I'm sure. So I think in my stories, a lot of it has to do with, again, the way that women are restricted in terms of, how they're told to be, etc. And so a lot of them have to forge their own paths. So, for example, in the story at Querirang, Noelia, at the end of the story, her quinceañera doesn't go on, and so she has to find another avenue towards womanhood. And so, which in that case is, losing her virginity. And so they have to make the characters in my book have to make these fundamental breaks from what they've been told all their lives to become new people. So there's another story in my book, a collection called The Light in the Sky, and it's the one that's sort of like truest in terms of like chronicling a trip that I took with my mom to Puerto Rico, including her paranoia about a UFO being in the sky. But during that trip, some of the things I noticed, all my family members would be like, oh, when are you going to get married? When are you going to have kids or whatever? And I would say never. And then the women, they'd be like, good, don't do it, So there's this sort of game that everybody's playing where they're playing along with the societal norms, but then covertly they're also like rejecting those norms. And so, I mean, my mother brings this up today too. She's like, oh, what must they say about you and your sister? Que son solteras, but, and you know what they're probably saying, but, I'm like, oh, I don't know. I'm like, I have a PhD. Like, I'm like, that's like, that should protect me from everything. I'm kidding. It doesn't, but I'm just saying there are other things in life, right? So.
Right. And Melissa, in your case, El Querirán is personified like a Shakespearean chorus by the factory women. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's this one particular character who works at the factory who all the women gossip about. I mean, they gossip about each other, but there's this one who is just like, oh, she's like the bad one, like she's doing all of these things at night and, whatever, like who bought her those earrings and not her husband. And it's like, but this is the character that Anna actually admires because she's just going out there and getting her money, like she's just doing her thing and she flaunts it, and so what, right? Like and the funny thing about El Querirán is that like it forces so many women, I think, to end up doing things in secret and to do things on the low, sometimes to their disadvantage, right? Like we're hurting our own our sisters by basically imposing this gaze on them that is really unfair. And so and that's what happens with the factory women and Nilda. And then that's also what happens with to Anna. She feels like she has to operate in the shadows almost, because she whether she realizes it or not, she does care about what other people think of her and of her actions, which is why she has so many secrets.
Well, I think the way you deal with this particular theme makes your work particularly current and very much 21st century examination of the role of women in our society. I just wanted to say a little something about fiction writing. And I always feel that some people feel that fiction writing is not valid because it's not real. But I feel that fiction writing allows us to probe even deeper into our realities. And I think that the best, people are always asking me, well, did this happen to you? Or is this real? Or did you live through this? And to me, that's the highest compliment, because it means that whatever it is I wrote is real to them and and feels true. And I think that all of your work, I am particularly impressed because I do feel like this could be autobiographical, or more likely it's fiction written on a really high level that makes you feel like it's autobiographical. So I thank you so much. I am so privileged to have read your work and gotten a chance to talk to you about it. And so, is there anything you would like to end with, is my question. Lorraine?
No, I mean, I feel like to that point, right, fiction gives us a lot of permission, like you said, to like explore things in a way where, right, if there's not a safety type of, for me, it felt a lot like maybe I don't have the safety or I don't want to run into family members or shit like that, right? Because yes, a lot of things influence my stories. So yeah, I definitely feel like fiction feels like the best avenue for telling the truth.
Great. Anyone else? Oh yes, Melissa.
I think that fiction gives us a real opportunity to be unapologetic in a way that we can't be in other places. Mm-hmm. The page actually is where we can be unapologetic through our characters, through our the actual writing, and I find that empowering for myself as an immigrant, as a woman, as a Peruana, as an Americana, you know, and I hope that it can also empower other women to be unapologetic in their lives. If these people that we create and we put on the page can be as fierce, can be fierce and can be strong, and maybe it'll muster some I don't want to say courage, but empowerment for the reader.
Great, thank you. Ivelisse?
I guess I have a slightly different take. I like fiction because I feel like I can hide. When people write nonfiction, I'm always like, I don't know, I couldn't expose myself in that way. Like, I think it takes an enormous amount of courage. Now I don't have that. And plus, like, I think with fiction, like I said, was saying with David, I had to make him around character, even though he was abusive. You have to really, delve into the minds of people that you may disregard or not think are good people, etc. And I think that's the benefit of fiction, is that you can traverse all these different mindsets and types of people and get to know who they are. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, last question. If you had to give advice in one sentence, what would you advise to an up-and-coming young writer? Melissa. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Melissa.
Okay. Don't get it perfect, just get it done.
Great. Thank you. Ivelisse?
Luck is variable. Some years you'll be lucky. Some years other people will be lucky. But luck can always come around back to you.
Okay. Lorraine?
Build writing community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can't do it alone. And my advice would be read everything, read constantly, and read as a writer. Try and find out why what you're reading works for you, and what doesn't work for you, why doesn't it work for you? And I think that that's a good place to end. Ladies, thank you so much for your time. And we will be watching for your next book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.